In today's video, what I want to talk about is the spiritual ego. This is something that I touched upon in the last video, and I really wanted to do a video just about that in itself, because I think it's a really important thing to recognize early on when you get into any spiritual practice. Again, I use the term spiritual as a placeholder for the purpose of these videos because it's something everybody's familiar with. And a lot of what it is I talk about on this channel could be considered spiritual subjects, but spirituality can be a very loaded term. But along a spiritual path, the spiritual ego is the trickiest thing to navigate. And what a spiritual ego is essentially what happens when your identity, your ego, your self-concept, the part of you which believes itself to be an entity with preferences and likes and dislikes and all of these different aspects that go into making you who you see yourself to be. When that part of you has some kind of experience that it believes to be a spiritual experience, whether it be some kind of mystical awakening, some kind of psychedelic breakthrough, it could be anything. It's completely unique to the individual, as spirituality always is. But what happens is when an individual has an experience that it sees as profound, it's very easy to be trapped within your identity, to allow that experience to create this sense within yourself that you're somehow now enlightened, that you're somehow now a spiritual being, somebody with a more broad view of the world, that you've become, somehow mystically changed by the experience that you've had. And it's a trap everybody falls into. Anytime you get into spiritual subjects, the ego, as I've explained in the previous video, its nature is to constantly define itself. It constantly protect itself, constantly attached to all of these experiences that it has in life. Everything that it encounters, it's trying to add to itself to create this overarching worldview so that it feels like it can navigate through life with more safety, more security. The more things it understands, the better it's going to be, the more it's able to navigate through life. And spirituality becomes a really tricky one, because the essence of spirituality, what it should really be about, is about not killing the ego, not removing the ego, but getting the ego in check, getting it in balance so that it doesn't become something that creates disharmony in life, that doesn't become something that creates suffering, that doesn't make the world into a worse place for your existing within it, right? Because that's what happens. A lot of the time, all the most destructive, disturbing aspects of human nature, they all stem from ego. They all stem from identity, from actions of service to self. War, poverty, corruption. Every terrible thing you can think of through history has always come from an ego that has come out of balance. And spirituality is one of the worst, because a person that has had a spiritual experience that they've attached to their ego can very easily slip into this kind of messiah complex, this sort of idea that because you've had some sort of realization that it's justifying this internal hierarchy that you're creating now between you and everybody else that hasn't had that same experience. You sort of see other people as lesser than yourself or less enlightened. And, when people say things like, oh, I'm awake and they're asleep, I'm calling people sheep and things like that. All this is the ego judging other people, or giving itself permission to judge other people, because it now believes itself to be superior because it's had some sort of awakening, some sort of enlightened experience. And it's the very antithesis of what enlightenment's supposed to be about, because what real enlightenment is about is not some newfound worldview which makes you somehow spiritual or liberated or somehow awakened, right? An enlightened person would never consider themselves to be enlightened. Enlightenment is just a recognition, it's an awareness of the relationship between all things, the relationship between yourself and life, between your ego and the awareness beneath that's witnessing the ego, between all of the different aspects of life, and recognizing that it's all about harmony, right? It's all about service to the whole versus service to the self. But the ego will take that worldview, that new understanding, and assign it to itself so that it can see itself as somehow superior to everything else. And in New Age spirituality, we have certain phrases that you hear. One of the most common is, you're not a human being having a spiritual experience, you're a spiritual being having a human experience. Now, there may be some truth to that, but statements like this are an example of what it is I'm saying here. They can very easily create this idea within the mind, within the ego. And the mind and the ego are essentially the same thing, right? It's synonymous. But it creates this idea that you define yourself by now as being a spiritual being, not a human being. And you've essentially crafted a new self-image that you're now attached to and defining yourself by. And this is the very problem with spirituality as a whole. This is why it's really important to become aware of your spiritual beliefs, your spiritual assumptions, and your relationship to those things. Because if you don't have those things in balance, if you don't have the perception or the awareness to see those things for what they are, they can very easily become additions to your ego, little aspects that your ego now defines itself with, lenses through which you view the world, and create this internal sense of self being higher than other, you know. And you see it a lot within religion, within spirituality, how many people claim to be in service to the highest benevolence in the universe, whether it be God or the source or whatever it might be, which all traditions acknowledge as being unconditionally loving, but then simultaneously, those same people will condemn other people for not agreeing with them, for not sharing the same worldview. And it doesn't just pertain to spirituality or religion, it also pertains to all forms of ideology and belief and perspective, such as, I mean, one of the most polarizing we can think of in the world is politics, right? How many people pick left and right with political ideologies, and they will violently condemn the opposition, and failing to see that this is precisely the point, that the ego creates suffering, creates disharmony through attachment. Anytime you become self-defined by what it is you are experiencing, it always ends up leading down the path of judgment, because in defining yourself, you create boundary, you create division between yourself and other. You will always see somebody that doesn't share the same perception of self as being separate from you. This is precisely what spirituality is about recognizing, about seeing that in truth, everything, and it's the most trite and conventional thing that you will ever hear with spirituality, but also one of the simplest truths, which is that everything is one, right? Not in some mystical way, not in some kind of pseudo-spiritual way where, you know, there's like this field of energy that we're all connected to. And that may be true, right? But just from the perception, the perspective of simple observation, all you have to do is look around you and see that, oh, I'm part of this world, right? I'm composed of the same materials, the same substance, the same patterns, the same design, the same symmetry and geometry and energy that composes everything is also within myself, is also within all the things I observe and experience. And from that perspective, from that simple observation, you can see that everything is one, right? I mean, I eat food, right? My body processes the food and it returns to the environment, which then becomes sustenance for other life to grow. Right? I breathe in oxygen, breathe out carbon dioxide, right? And then the plants breathe that in, process it, and breathe it back out as something I can breathe, right? My body is supposedly composed of these 50 trillion cells, each one composed of trillions upon trillions of atomic little packets of energy, right? It's all the same thing, all connected, all moving in unison. And my relationship to that can either be one of harmony and peace and acceptance, where I move with it. I don't create disturbance in life. I don't add to the chaos of life. I don't disrupt that natural flow. And I live in harmony with it, right? But by identifying with the self, identifying with the ego, you self-separate from all of that. The ego, in its survival programming, will always perceive itself to be completely removed from that whole nature of existence, that you are part of everything. It always sees itself because that's its mechanism. That's the way it perceives, right? The ego is all about observing the environment, defining things, analyzing, categorizing, breaking reality down into things that it can observe and contemplate and compartmentalize so that it can process this world and create a worldview. And then it defines itself by what it's experienced, right? It creates a concept of itself so that it can understand itself. And in doing so, cuts itself off from feeling connected to everything else, feeling like it is part of this world, right? I mean, none of this takes belief. You don't have to believe yourself to be some kind of spiritual being. You may be. We might genuinely be souls inhabiting human bodies, but I think you never really need to go that far with this kind of spiritual perspective on life. You can gain everything you need to know about life and your relationship to it by observing it, witnessing it without judgment. And what you find with spiritual beliefs, spiritual ego, is it's all about judgment, right? When you take on a belief system or a worldview, the ego then frames its entire perspective on life through the lens of that worldview, right? And in doing so, creates judgment, creates condemnation, creates resistance. These worldviews create a more defined sense of self, right? You say, you know, I'm spiritual, I'm Christian, I'm Buddhist, I'm Hindu, I'm left-leaning, I'm right-leaning. All of these things, although not inherently evil or wrong, always lead down the path of defining oneself in relation to one's perspective, right? And when we do this, you simply create division, you create disharmony. The more that the ego adds to itself, the more it defines itself, the more it believes that it's increasing its own nature, that's becoming more powerful, more defined, more liberated, more free, more whole, right? The ego believes that it creates more wholeness within itself by further and further defining itself. The truth is actually the opposite. Once you start to see what is happening, that when you define yourself, you're not increasing your nature, you're limiting it, right? Because any attribute that you add to yourself, any boundary by which you define yourself, whether it be Christian, Buddhist, Hindu, politically leaning right or left, you know, whether you have a certain preference which you think defines you, anytime you self-identify and create these categories for yourself, you're creating boundary, right? You can like what you like and dislike what you dislike. You can have certain perceptions and perspectives. But when you allow those things to be the defining aspect of your being, you essentially wall yourself into a worldview, a sense of self, an egoic identity, which then creates division between you and those that don't share the same worldview. And this is where the spiritual ego comes in again, because the spiritual ego is essentially a being, a person whose ego has been defined by some kind of experience that they've had that they see to be spiritual. That you've had a spiritual experience, some mystical experience, maybe you've found God or, you know, whatever it might be. And the ego now sees itself as being a spiritual being. You now define yourself as that. And once you fall into that trap, it's very difficult to undo that. You have to become aware of what's happening. You have to see that you're creating this self-concept, which, if you're not careful, can become something that allows you to judge other people, that you see as less than you. In truth, the spiritual realization that you come to when you've transcended that illusion, when you've stepped back, perhaps, maybe not transcended, but when you step back and see that that's what's happening, that I'm seeing myself as spiritual and seeing other people as less than that, then you start to see what's really going on, which is that I'm not spiritual. I am awareness, witnessing. I simply am a state of awareness, observing and experiencing. And from that position, you start to see, without judgment, that everything is whole, everything is equal, everything is balanced, everything is completely valid. All things are connected and part of this infinite flow, this infinite vast experience we call life. And that any time I become enticed into the ego with its beliefs that the more it defines itself, the more powerful it's going to become, the more it defines itself, the better it is. The more I become pulled into that, the more I end up doing one simple thing, which is I create suffering. I create disharmony in life. When I judge other people, when I see myself as better than other people, when I condemn people, when I fall into any of those traps of thinking that my ego makes me better, I create judgment, I create condemnation, I create suffering, right? And all you have to do is look through history to see that any form of judgment, any form of an ego that is out of balance always leads down a path of suffering, always creates disharmony. One person with disharmony within themselves, where they see themselves to be greater than others, that ripples out into the world, and their actions create multiplied suffering in the world, right? And spirituality is not about that, right? This is why when you start to see that, and you start to see that that's the tendency of the ego, it's really important to keep that in check. That these experiences you're having that you call spiritual, that you call mystical, they're not about you. They are simply perceptions, they're experiences. They are things which give you, if you allow them to do so, a wider range of perception, a more expanded state of awareness where you can hopefully, if you understand the point, become more compassionate, become more accepting, more loving. This is the nature of expanded awareness, is not so that you become more mystical and more enlightened or more powerful, right? It's so that you become more compassionate, because the more your awareness expands, when it doesn't become trapped in the boundaries of ego that would have you believing that your awareness is expanded and become more enlightened, if you can allow that expansion to take place and not define yourself by it, you see that when I become more aware, I become more accepting, I become more compassionate, and I can see that perhaps this person that I think has wronged me, maybe it's because they're suffering. And maybe the best approach isn't to condemn them, but to understand them and to feel for them and to not create more suffering in life because of my judgment, because of my condemnation for that person. And you start to see that this is it, right? I mean, the ego judges the self, the real self, right? The self that is beyond the self, your awareness beneath the identity, beneath that egoic construct that you think is you, is not judgmental. It's just aware. It's awareness in a state of eternal peace, right? It just sees clearly what is. And in that state, you don't judge, you don't condemn, you don't resist. You recognize that all of those things, those habits of the ego, are always about one thing, which is to act in service to yourself. And when you do that, you create suffering, you create disharmony, right? You create separation. The ego in its nature is one of separation. If you act in service to that separate thing, you will create separation in life. This is why you see the boundaries between people with differing beliefs, the left versus right, religious versus atheist, racial differences, any form of differences, whether it be gender differences. Anytime there is an over-identification with one side or the other, there is conflict. There is resistance. The only way you transcend that is to not become over-identified with your sense of self, and to recognize that when you become aware of your true nature, which is awareness, that you can see clearly the opposition. You can see clearly the alternate perspective of the other side without judgment, right? And you're able to see why this person sees this way, but not from a place of judgment. You don't say, they're wrong and I'm right. You say, oh, right, I see why they've come to that understanding. I might not necessarily agree with it, but I know that if I judge them for it, I'm creating the same disharmony in life that I'm supposed to be moving beyond, that I'm supposed to be leaving behind, right? That in truth, it's very simple. I either increase the suffering of life or I increase the harmony, right? Ego creates suffering. Awareness, the true self, which is part of everything, that is transcendent of the limitations of my concept of self, that part of me doesn't judge. That part of me is in harmony with everything. And it becomes a choice of whether you choose to be pulled into the enticement of ego and its sense that it's going to become more powerful and more spiritual, or to recognize that you're simply experiencing expanded states of consciousness, that you're just becoming more aware and it's not about you, it's actually for the service of the whole. That the more aware you become, the more spiritual you think you become, it's actually about the service to the whole. You've become more aware so that you can serve greatly, right? Not so that you can become enlightened or spiritual, right? And that's really the trap. That's the biggest problem with spirituality as a whole. This is why when I say spiritual, I feel the need to clarify what I mean by that, because I don't want people to think that what I'm talking about is any particular form of spirituality, that I'm talking about, new age or religious or any of that. I'm simply pointing out through these videos, I'm trying to encourage a level of awareness of all of this so that you don't fall into the traps of creating suffering in life, creating disharmony, judgment, condemnation, where you move away from that and become more accepting and more peaceful. And that's really the whole point of this, right? It's again why I've called this channel Beyond the Self, and why I'm doing this channel in the first place, because I think it's doing these meditations and learning this practice of not judging and not resisting has increased my empathy and my compassion. And I think that's the whole point. I think we all know inherently that kindness and love is obviously the ultimate truth, right? In terms of spirituality, it is the ultimate truth. I mean, everything else is just about you. And real spirituality should be about moving beyond that. So to sum it up, I think the best approach to keep the ego in check is to practice awareness, practice noticing how you feel when you go down this path. What do you feel when you have a so-called spiritual experience? What does your sense of self look like when that happens? How do you define yourself when these things take place? Say you have some kind of, let's say you watch my videos and that you learn the meditation practices that I'm going to be teaching, and then you have some kind of what you call a mystical experience, maybe an expanded state of awareness. What does it feel like when that happens, right? Notice how quickly you'll reframe yourself as somebody that's spiritual or that sees clearly or that has become more evolved or more enlightened. And anytime you do that, the ego loves that, right? It's like food for the ego, because it can go, oh yeah, I'm spiritual, I'm enlightened. And that's the biggest trap. It's the main trap. It's the big one, because again, to leave this video as a closing point, the whole point of spirituality is about getting that in balance, about recognizing that it isn't actually about you, that it's about service to the whole. It's about creating kindness and harmony and compassion and love, and not increasing the disharmony and the separation, which is where we're at as a species right now. I mean, you just look at the state of the world, you're beginning to see all the cracks of where, generations of ego and imbalance has led, all the things that have been caused by that. And the correct path is not to go down the same road of self-identity and thinking that this life is about you, because it's not. It's about the whole. We have an ego, we have a separate self, we have an identity, but we also are part of something infinitely vast and beautiful, and we're not more important than that. It's like one of the cells in your body developing a sense of identity and then thinking that it's better than the whole, right? I mean, this is the very cause of disease, right? Where things start to grow out of harmony with the rest of it. You can see that human nature has become somewhat of a disease in that respect through that way of thinking. And it's just an imbalance, right? And spirituality can become as divisive and imbalanced as politics. It's just whether you decide to follow through with the programming of the ego or whether you choose to move beyond that and to let go of those judgments and come back into alignment with the whole. So, yeah, hopefully that's all made sense. And again, if you've made it this far in the video, I'm really grateful for anybody that takes the time to watch these. You know, the reason why I'm doing this is I want to add to the harmony of life and not increase the suffering. And if I can just help a few people, you know, maybe see with clarity and become less judgmental, then I've done my job. So, yeah, if you made it this far, thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one. So have a great day.